Welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and my guest today is Wendy Wallas. Wendy has lived in the area for about 40 years, and she spends most of her time in El Salvador. She's helped to establish a community radio station called Radio Victoria there. Welcome, Wendy.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Good to have you on the show, and to have you here in the States visiting.
Yeah, great time to be here.
That's right, because it's the rainy season in El Salvador?
It's very rainy right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you go back and it's summer. Is that right?
It will be what they call summer, yeah.
Summer's good in November. Summer's real good.
Yeah.
So you ended up here, as I said, in the 70s, but you grew up in North Carolina in the South.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I was born and bred at Tar Heel down in North Carolina, and lived there till I was 18, and then I went off to college and lasted a couple of years, and then it was kind of a turbulent time, the late 60s, and I dropped out and kind of was part of that back to the land sort of movement.
Yes.
Out in the countryside in Wisconsin, and then eventually ended up in upstate New York for a couple of months, right across the river right across the border from Vermont, and found a place to stay up near Fairhaven, Vermont. And met people and ended up coming down to the Brattleboro area, living in Guilford for a while, and now in Putney.
In Putney, yes.
Yeah.
And you were, yes, back to the Landers, Guilford. It was sort of the epicenter.
Yes,
right?
yes. We had a group called Amber Waves. That was really fun because we produced, we once did a dinner at the Common Ground, and everything at the dinner had been locally produced, and that was a long time ago.
Isn't that wonderful to realize that?
Yeah.
That was happening then.
Yeah, one day we harvested wheat, and I ground it and made bread that very day. That was great.
Yeah, and it's incredible the things that we did back then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying things that we had no idea. We didn't really have to go through all that to do it, but it was really great to discover it.
It was good.
You were part of that whole counterculture here in Vermont as well.
Yes.
And how did you get interested in Central America?
Well, I think growing up in the South, and I grew up where we had a dinner table where there were a lot of discussions about what was going on in the Vietnam War and situation of civil rights, and so I kind of grew up with a consciousness, and was involved in marches and draft counseling.
Yes, right.
With some Quakers, and actually I went to a Quaker camp here in Vermont. I went to Farm and Wilderness, which was very important in my formation.
Yes. As a teen you were there?
Yes, that was really special. So here in the Brattleboro area, we began to see what was going on in Central America, and a group of us came together, and my friend Kevin and I had a friend who had just been to Nicaragua, who had gone through a revolution, and we were very curious, and we decided to go down, and we went and spent, I think, almost a month there. Wow. And it was pretty intense time because it was between when the revolution had triumphed and when the Contra War started.
Oh wow! Early 80s.
Early 80s.
Yeah.
It was 82. So and so we learned so much. I mean, it was a real big learning curve to experience that and talk to people and see this revolution unfolding with literacy brigades and health brigades, and just wonderful and fascinating. And we came back and we began to talk, and so this organization formed, and we carried out a lot of educational work and political work, even going down to Washington and talking to our representatives. So yeah, and then I somehow kept finding a way to get back down to Central America, picking cotton, picking coffee, being on some peace walk, and so kept learning more and more, and just kind of were very drawn into what was going on there, and seeing what our government was doing, and feeling like we had to be talking about what we had seen and experienced, and not just let the government kind of keep telling lies about what was going on.
Right.
I guess I felt more and more drawn, and it's very beautiful place. Central America is beautiful. The people are very friendly and open and warm and fun. So it sort of felt like home in a lot of ways.
Really?
Yeah.
Going down there, you were getting to know people, getting to know organizations as well. So you're really embedding yourself. I mean, embedded means different things now, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't use that word.
Let's not use that word. Okay. So you were making it your home, actually. You were that comfortable.
Yeah, I felt very drawn to going back. I didn't really say, oh, I want to live here. I did eventually go back to college. I was accepted to the Ada Comstock program at Smith College, and went back and studied Latin American studies, and studied Spanish, and got my Spanish a little bit better. I guess it was '88, and that summer I got an independent study, and I went to El Salvador, and I worked or accompanied or was working with a trade union federation, learning about what they were doing and about a sister union program that they had, which was to help protect union leaders in El Salvador that were just being snatched off the street continuously, and either being tortured and interrogated, or worse. They would put them on TV, and they would force them to sign a blank piece of paper, and then they would fill it in and make them read it on TV. I mean, just horrible, horrible things. So it was a very intense time, and I felt like I did have a space there. They had a video camera that I started documenting what was going on, and when I came back in the fall of '88, I pretty much spent my last semester making a video about this sister union movement.
Wow. And when you say sister union, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a union, for example, in the United States, like the SEIU, would become a sister union with a union in El Salvador, and so they would have constant communication. And if there was someone who was captured from that union in El Salvador, this union would, make phone calls, send whatever we did then, faxes or whatever, and put pressure on to get that person released. And that made a huge difference.
Did it?
Yes.
Yes, you could see that.
Yes.
That's pretty exciting.
And so it was unions, not just in the U.S., in Europe, in Australia. There was quite a network.
There was. And these were things that a lot of us did not know about back in the States, right?
Yeah.
But you were down there, I mean, I'm sure what you're doing, it was very exciting, but it was also pretty dangerous work that you were doing, right?
Yeah, the union building got bombed a few times.
Did
and the last time it was really, it was bombed in the middle of the night once, so that wasn't so bad. And then there was this really big bomb that was right at midday, and the Union Federation had a popular kitchen where a lot of people came to eat lunch, because it was inexpensive. It was sort of subsidized by Norwegian unions. And they set the bomb off right in front of that. 10 people were killed, and it was horrible.
And were these people you knew?
People I worked with,
Really?
Yeah.
That must have been something to go through that.
Yeah, well, it was a very intense time.
Yeah.
It was a very intense time.
It was, and again, but you were fully engaged in it as
Yes.
well, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you had taken that on, you decided that's where you wanted to be.
Well, I was caught up in it.
Yes.
I don't know how much conscious, I think I'll stay here. And, I think I was caught up in it and felt like I had a role there. Right. And, being union workers, what happened was immediately the electrical workers union came in, the telephone workers union came in, they set up the fax machines, they got things reconnected, and we began to be able to communicate with the world about what was happening here. So that, El Salvador is organized. People are organized there, especially in the 70s and 80s.
Really?
Highly organized.
Really?
So things, got done.
Wow.
It had, a guerrilla force that was seen as the most well-developed, efficient, whatever, I don't know what you could say, but just a very competent guerrilla force in the country at that time. Salvadorans are generally known to be very hard workers. I find them to be very smart, very creative, and very good at organizing. You know, there's a joke where they say if three Salvadorans come together on a street corner, they'll organize some organization.
Really?
They'll put it together right there. So, and that's part of, you know, what happened was the resistance against the repression that went on. You know, that people were really forced into a situation where they had to figure out how to resist and rebel against this regime of very wealthy people that the United States government was supporting to the tune of $1.5 million a day for 12 years, which comes to $6 billion in this tiny little country the size of Massachusetts with 5 million people.
Wow.
So you can imagine, what could you do with $6 million or $1.5 million a day in a country like that? Yes. What you could build. Yeah. But no, it was bombs and bullets and destruction.
That must have been very difficult.
Yeah, yeah, and I was always like, well, I'm a gringa, don't they? Never, no one ever said anything to me. They were all always happy, and they would say, we know how to make a difference between the people of the United States and the government of the United States. We're very clear about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they were very savvy about what was going on.
Very savvy, yeah.
Do you think some of that comes from their history of having to fight for their rights continually against one regime after another?
Oh yeah, they followed politics here very closely, still do.
And still do, yeah. You were there at a time when there were so many really huge cultural changes. What did you see that was very notable about that?
Well, of course, I was there when the war ended, when the peace accords were signed, and it was, you know, euphoric and exciting, although, you know, we didn't really know what was going to happen. Right. But at that time, I was living in the countryside in a very rural community that had no electricity, had no, you know, contact, really. I mean, they were in what was called a controlled zone, so it was a zone controlled by the rebel group. And so to get there, you had to go through military checkpoints and things like that. And so, you know, it was like immediately when the peace accords were signed, the checkpoints were gone. Anybody could travel wherever they wanted in the country. And in our community, which is called Santa Marta, which I'm still very connected to, the idea of a community radio came up, or community media. Because we, you know, there weren't any cell phones, there weren't even any telephones. You had to travel an hour through the dirt roads or the paths to get to the town of Victoria, where there were 2 phone lines. Wow. So, you know, to have any contact, there are no newspapers. Radio, you know, if you had batteries for your radio, you could listen to the radio. And people did that. Radio was a big thing. And so the idea of starting a radio came up, and since I had been doing video and photography, they said, oh, we'll send her to those meetings. And that was a great thing for me to get involved in this project.
Yes, and so what meetings were you sent to?
They were meetings about a group of people that had the same idea of starting. We started 5 different radios in different parts of the country at the same time. Yeah.
Throughout the country of El Salvador.
Tiny country.
It is a tiny country, right? but it does have regions, right, that are pretty distinct?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a big Pacific Ocean coastline. There's volcanoes through the middle of the country, and then there are mountains in the north.
Yes.
And so there's, you know, coastal plains and volcanoes that erupt once in a while. There are earthquakes that happen. It's very beautiful country. Yeah. It's very green in the rainy season, and, you know, lots of wonderful fruits and vegetables, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful country.
Yeah, and you know, I think that again, you know, I think that our images of it, much like, you know, the idea of Vietnam becoming a travel destination, which happened, you know, sometime in the 90s. For those of us who lived through it, it was a disconnect, you know. So for us to think and to know about El Salvador as a lush, beautiful country with all of these attributes. It's new. It's new for us to know that. That's new information.
Good.
Yes,
Yeah.
good is right. And the idea too, which I didn't know before, was how challenged it is also geographically. And when you talk about volcanoes and hurricanes.
Environmentally.
Yes.
It's one of the most vulnerable countries. It's within the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world.
Wow.
Because it's very volcanic.
Yep.
And, that's part of its history, too. I mean, the Mayans lived there, and then they left because there were so many, there was a huge volcanic eruption, like in the, some people say there was so much ash cloud that it drifted to Europe and caused the Dark Ages in Europe. I mean, there is a theory, a scientific theory about that. So yeah, I mean, there is a place in El Salvador, an archaeological site that's kind of a Pompeii, where it was so covered in dust that when in the 70s, when it was starting to be uncovered, you could see what daily life was like there. I mean, there were pots with food in them and plants, the outline of plants, and I mean, you could really see what the life was. And some of it was not that different from how some people are still living.
Really?
I mean, just some similar things. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, you talk about how savvy the El Salvadorans are. Salvadorans? Is that correct?
I say Salvadorans.
Salvadorans.
Yeah.
And how able they are to organize. But there's still a primitive quality, it sounds like, to a lot of their daily life.
Well, that's because of the wealth gap that we're feeling more and more here in the United States. Those that have it, that have way, way, way too much. The very few, and then the huge minority that has I mean, that's one of the roots of the war,
Right.
feeling that, and also there's a whole movement within, of course, El Salvador is a Catholic country. Now it is a little less and less, but the church in the 60s went through a whole big change where everything used to be in Latin. They began to do masses in the language of wherever they were, even in indigenous languages.
Yeah.
And the priest would face the congregation instead of having his back to the congregation. And people could start to read the Bible, which they didn't do before.
Interesting.
And so people read the Bible and said, this is what happened then. That's kind of like what's happening now. And God didn't like that. I don't think he really wants our kids dying of diarrhea and these diseases that could be. I think, we're human beings. We're not beasts of burden. We have dignity. And so this whole, after kind of bowing their heads for 500 years, they could say, no, I am a person. And they would have kind of Bible study groups and created these what were called Christian-based communities, which is all part of the liberation theology. So the church made this huge change, and that had a big effect.
I'll bet it had a big effect, yes.
And also there was very blatant electoral fraud.
Right.
And so people would protest, and they would get met by bullets and machine guns and tanks. And so what do?
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to people, they say, we were obliged to take up arms, the rebels. We were obliged. We didn't want to, but we tried this avenue. We tried, tried to get land reform.
Yeah.
We tried the electoral process.
Right. Right.
And so the wealthy, the entrenched,
Yeah.
super wealthy, they weren't willing to give an inch.
Right.
Even Monsignor Romero, who some may have heard of, he was just sainted a year ago, right now, this month. He was very clear, saying, if you don't give up a little bit, they're going to cut your hand off.
Yep. Comes the revolution, right?
Yeah. That was a very intense time, and there is a wonderful book that just came out and actually has been nominated for the National Book Award, which is a book by Carolyn Forche, who's a poet, a wonderful poet. This is not a book of poetry. It's a narrative, almost kind of a memoir, because she was in El Salvador before I was there in the late 70s. And it's very beautifully written and fascinating journey about what was going on in that time and how she got there, how she was pulled into it by a very enigmatic person. So I highly recommend it. It's called What You Have Heard Is True, Carolyn Forche. I know it's in the Putney Public Library.
Yeah.
A little plug there.
Yes.
But I highly recommend it for everybody if you're interested in a journey that's somewhat similar to my journey. And I met Carolyn in the early 90s in Santa Marta. We connected and just recently saw her in Putney. So it's been kind of an interesting circle.
She was here for the literary festival, I believe, this year.
Not this year. She was here for the Wood Bookstock. Is that what it's called? Bookstock in Woodstock. Yeah, I didn't see her at that, but I was able to connect with her.
That's so great. Yeah, no, she's done she did a lot of deep work back in that time. And I have heard it's a wonderful book. Yeah. Let's talk about the radio.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this wonderful thing that you've taken part of, Radio Victoria.
Yes, it is a victory. It is in the village of Victoria, but it was named also Radio Victoria because it is a victory for our rural communities. And it is a community radio. We've had to struggle from the get-go. It was the early 90s, so just after the war had ended. The peace accords were signed in 92, and we started dreaming about it like 91. 93, July of 93, we went on the air for the first time. None of us knew anything about radio, so we'd been learning on the job, so to speak. And we just went on the air.
Yeah.
We weren't assigned a frequency, so we found an opening in the dial and we went on the air. And then, we kept trying to get a frequency and they'd say, oh, well, you need this. And we'd go, oh, okay, and we get that. Well, now you need this. So it was always some obstacle.
Right.
And meanwhile, these commercial radios were getting frequencies. So sometimes we would have to move from one frequency to the other, wherever there was an open frequency. But people found us, and so then eventually we became part of a national organization of community radios because those 5, there were other initiatives starting up, and now there are 22 community radios in El Salvador. That gave us a little more elbow room, or power. So we just completed 26 years of being on the air.
Congratulations.
And yeah, it's pretty exciting.
You've taken on a lot of different kinds of projects.
Well, what we did is that once we sort of got legal and we didn't have to worry about that anymore, and then we kind of went through a phase of getting equipment because it was a time when things were being digitized. We started going, well, what does it mean to be a community radio? How can we be a real community radio? And we began to analyze and talk about where we are and who lives where we are and what the living conditions are and what the needs are, and talking to people and pulling people into this discussion. And we came up with a few projects that are really pretty vital for the radio. And I mean, we do have our own news show that we produce and other shows, and we have community groups that produce their own shows on the radio. But we created a network of community correspondents. So we trained some, not only young people, but a lot of them are young people, to do interviews and kind of soundings on certain themes. And so they could send news stories into our radio, into our news show, every day or every few days, and have more broad information from our territory, our coverage, and also so different communities could learn about each other. And then we also have a project that is wonderful that's called Radio Victoria Walks to the Communities. And we don't always walk. Sometimes we're in the back of a truck for 2 or 3 hours to get to these communities. And we spend the whole day there. We just leave one person in the radio building, and we all get in the back of a truck, and we go. And we start talking to people, interviewing. We transmit live part of it on the radio. We play games with the kids. We interview the kids. We have a meeting with all the community leaders, the women, the school, the health, whatever, all of the community leaders to hear about what their community is about, what their problems are. And we've helped to accompany them in some of their struggles. For example, there was one community that they said, oh, our kids only go to school in the dry season. And we were like, what? How can that be? And so we started calling around, and there were 3 municipalities, and they all kind of bordered on this community, and they all kind of washed their hands of it. So, we just kept needling on it, and eventually it was a private person came up with some money to rebuild the bridge that had been washed away with a hurricane.
Uh-huh.
And now the kids can go to school all year. So we can't solve the problems. We can't give people the money to solve the problems. But we're a voice there, and we can put their voices on so that the pressure is put on.
Yes.
And so, that's been that's a way for people to feel that this really is their radio.
Yes.
And that's what we say all the time. This is your radio. Mm-hmm. And then they want to come to the radio. They want to visit the radio. And they do come. And they come in droves for our anniversary.
Uh-huh.
And musicians, local musicians, we record local musicians' music and put it on the radio. So it's quite a dynamic project.
It is a dynamic project. So a lot of what you are doing in El Salvador is connecting people and connecting communities and making all of these things available to people that wouldn't have it. And I think that a lot of what we've been doing here in America over the last couple of years, we're so lucky. We have these community stations here, and now we are fighting for them. This is the first time we really had to work with the FCC, or we're dealing with the FCC for this continuance of freedom of speech. And I think that at root, all community radio and TV communication is about that. You talked about El Salvadorans coming into their own individualities, and recognizing each other as humans. And you've managed to, you and your cohort have managed to really create something that is cohesive for the country.
Yeah, and it's part of a bigger national movement through our Community Radio Association to democratize media.
Yes.
So, that is, we've been through a lot of struggles, and we didn't talk about the whole mining struggle that we went through, which was very difficult, and ended up, along with many organizations in El Salvador, having the first law in any country in the world to prohibit metallic mining, which is so damaging environmentally.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
But democratizing communications is about it's community media and community access and different sectors of the country, like indigenous groups, women's groups, student groups, having access to media. So it's not just the people who have money who are controlling, what we're seeing and hearing all the time, which is just so powerful. We all need to have that.
Well, you're speaking for all of us. This is what we've been talking about over the last year in America, and so this is sort of a constant way of getting people to remember and to get to know what they need to do in order to keep this, and in order to further it.
Vital.
So, thank you. Yes. Thank you so much for doing the work you're doing and for letting us know about it.
Well, I'm lucky to be where I am in El Salvador. I fell into a fantastic group of people, and I just am learning, I keep learning, and I keep enjoying the people that I've been able to work with.
Oh, it's a wonderful
Taught
thing.
me so much,
It's a wonderful thing. Thank you so much, Wendy.
Pleasure.
Yeah,
a pleasure.
wonderful
Thank
to have
you.
you on. And thanks to all of you for joining us today and to hear everything that Wendy is talking about. Stay tuned. We're a weekly show. Come back next week for more Here We Are.